If you released a Spinosaurus into the Florida Everglades, the question wouldn't be whether it would survive. The question is how long the Everglades will be able to withstand it.
Spinosaurus stands
Because this wasn't the kind of predator that walks into a strange place and slowly dies from not being able to adapt. Quite the opposite. This was almost one of the very few places in the modern world that looked like a playground for Spinosaurus, making things serious. Hot, humid, flooded, full of channels, full of semi-aquatic hunting grounds. In other words, this wasn't a place to kill it instantly. This was a place to give it a real chance. And that's the bad news. A moderately dangerous animal won't bring down the system. It intrudes, grabs a bit of food, and is then gradually eroded by the environment. But Spinosaurus wasn't a small problem. It was a giant predator designed almost specifically for shallow, murky waters, muddy edges, and prey that didn't have time to react. If it established itself in the Everglades, it wouldn't just add its name to the food chain. It would bend the entire chain. That's the crucial point to make right from the start. This story isn't about whether a dinosaur could survive in a modern swamp. It's about what would happen to an already strained ecosystem when a new predator, one it wasn't designed to cope with, is introduced. Initially, the impact will be minimal. No one will look at the water and immediately say, "There are dinosaurs in there." The first signs will appear. Stable hunting grounds begin to empty faster than usual. Waterfront areas that once had a fixed rhythm of life begin to become unpredictable. Native species won't understand exactly what has intruded, but they will sense the pressure before humans can name it. And once that pressure started to spread, the Everglades entered a very bad situation. Because an ecosystem like this only remains balanced when all predators are playing by the old rules. Spinosaurus wasn't. It didn't come to claim a small corner of territory. It didn't enter as a typical alien species. If it adapted quickly enough, it would become a kind of mobile system glitch. Something large enough to exert predatory pressure across entire shallow waters. Agile enough to exploit a variety of food sources. And bizarre enough in form not to quite interact in a way familiar to any native predator. That's why this topic is so interesting. It wasn't because Spinosaurus looked cool. It wasn't because of who would win in a fictional battle. It was because the Everglades was the kind of place that made the idea seem plausible in the early stages. And it was that very sense of plausibility that ultimately led to far worse consequences. If you throw it into an environment that's too cold, too dry, too barren, the story ends prematurely. It fails. The movie is over. But Everglades doesn't give the story such a quick death. Everglades gives it room to try, room to hunt, room to grow, room to begin to win. And as soon as it starts winning, everything else will start losing. Therefore, the opening question should not be whether Spinosaurus could have existed in Florida. The correct question should be this: if a prehistoric predator truly found a foothold in the Everglades, which would collapse first? The food chain, the native species, or the monster that just thought it had found a home? To establish itself in the Florida Everglades, Spinosaurus didn't need to do anything spectacular in the first few weeks. It just needs to do one very simple thing: eat enough to avoid dying. It may sound insignificant, but this is the crucial part that determines the whole story. Because many predators, which sound fearsome in theory, die right at the first step when thrown into a new ecosystem. Not because they are weak, but because they cannot find a way to consistently convert the unfamiliar environment into enough calories to survive. To become king later on, you must first get through the most tedious but cruel stage. You must not starve to death. And the Everglades, unfortunately, gave Spinosaurus exactly what it needed to overcome that obstacle. It wasn't a giant prey. It wasn't a battle that would shake the swamp. What saved it was abundance. A network of shallow, murky water, muddy banks, just enough fish, just enough careless birds, just enough slow turtles, just enough frequent waterside carcasses. Each item was insignificant, but combined, it was an ecosystem rich enough that a new predator didn't need to win big immediately. It just needed to win just enough times in a row. And Spinosaurus is the kind of creature that's perfectly suited to winning just enough. It's not the type to expend energy on long chases on land. It doesn't need to turn the entire area into a noisy stampede. It's better suited to a silent hunt. Murky water is its friend. Chaotic shorelines are its friend. Places where prey would disappear from the face of the earth if it were just a split second slower. That's its playground. So in the first few weeks, its way of standing up won't be through dominance. Instead, it will be by quickly learning a simple rule. Don't hunt the hardest thing. Hunt the easiest thing to repeat. That's the difference between a monster and a long-lived monster. If Spinosaurus charged into the Everglades with the mindset of a machine simply wanting to crush everything bigger in the area, it would quickly shoot itself in the foot. More collisions, more injuries, more exhaustion, higher risks. But if it did things more rationally, that is, if it clung to stable, easily accessible food sources in the shallow waters where its body thrived best, then the swamp would begin to nourish it instead of working against it. And that's when things started to go wrong. Because once an invasive predator finds a stable feeding rhythm, it's no longer an accident. It begins to become a force. The shallow waters of the Everglades were a haven for many species, where a sense of relative safety prevailed. Not absolute safety. In Florida, that sounds rather ridiculous. But a kind of safety that allowed them to know when to go into the water, when to forage, and when to take risks. Spinosaurus shattered that very same level of safety. It transformed areas that were once only cyclically dangerous into areas of far more unpredictable danger. That's what increases predator pressure across the board. A native animal typically has familiar boundaries. It hunts according to familiar habits. It occupies territory according to familiar logic. The rest of the species have evolved around that logic. But Spinosaurus had no history with the Everglades. It didn't come with the same set of rules that this ecosystem was accustomed to dealing with. It came as a new question, for which none of the species here had ready answers. And in the early stages, its greatest advantage was not its teeth, not its claws, and not its size. But it's strange. An unfamiliar predator always has weeks, months, or even longer to benefit from the fact that no one understands its hunting methods, where it appears, and when it is most dangerous. That is the most valuable time. And if Spinosaurus can take advantage of that time, it will have enough energy to grow larger, stronger, and more stable. Once it has overcome that initial vulnerability, removing it from the ecosystem will be much more difficult. So the question in this part isn't really whether it can find food or not. Rather, the question is whether it can obtain food consistently enough to become a long-term problem. And the answer is most likely yes. It's not that the Everglades are weak. It's that the Everglades are too rich. Too many nooks and crannies. Too many scattered sources of life. Too many transitional zones between water and land. A semi-aquatic predator, intelligent enough, wouldn't see this place as a battlefield. It would see it as a buffet system, stretching hundreds of kilometers, where, as long as it's not too greedy in the early stages, it can successfully take root. But it is also here that the biggest trap begins to appear. The better Spinosaurus stood, the closer it was to the inevitable collision. Because eating small, readily available things for the first few weeks was the perfect way to survive. But it couldn't stay there forever. This creature wasn't born to survive as a scavenger on the edge of the sea. Once it grew larger, its energy needs would increase. Its territory would have to expand. Its presence would no longer be stealthy, and by then, the Everglades would no longer be a place for it to hide. Everglades will begin to realize there's something new here. In other words, Part 2 was the best phase Spinosaurus could have hoped for in Florida. No fanfare, no dominance, no one really naming the threat. Just a series of weeks in which it quietly transformed from a bizarre ability into a creature with a real place in the world. And as soon as that happens, the story no longer belongs to it. The story then shifts to the reaction of the rest of the swamp. Because once the Everglades started feeling new pressure, the old predators wouldn't continue pretending nothing was wrong. Florida's Everglades was already a bad place enough without any further bad ideas. Water was everywhere, but almost nowhere was truly safe. Everything here was eating something else, waiting to eat something else, or trying not to be eaten. And if you had to choose one place in the modern world that looked closest to the environment for a Spinosaurus, unfortunately, the Everglades would be a pretty logical choice. It was hot. It was muddy. It was waterlogged. It had shallow, murky waters where whatever was swimming beneath the surface only became apparent when it was too late. In other words, if you dropped a giant semi-aquatic predator in here, the first question wouldn't be whether it would survive. The question would be how long the place could withstand it. That's the scary part. An animal that's only dangerous in theory won't change the entire ecosystem. It enters, struggles for a while, and then dies out because it can't adapt to the rhythm of life there. But Spinosaurus wasn't that kind of minor problem. Its body structure was practically made for turbulent waterfronts. A long snout to grip slippery prey, conical teeth to grip rather than tear, a powerful tail to propel its body through the water, a massive enough mass to turn any collision around the shore into bad news for anything nearby. It didn't need to enter the Everglades like a king from the start. It just needed to enter quietly enough so the ecosystem wouldn't realize it had just made another serious mistake. And then, it would begin to establish itself in the simplest way possible. Not with a spectacular slaughter. Not with a battle that would shake the entire swamp. Just by eating enough, regularly, to avoid starvation. That's what determines the whole story. If a new predator doesn't find a stable source of energy in the first few weeks, it's over very quickly. But the Everglades were so rich in things perfectly suited for a creature like Spinosaurus to take root. Shallow waters, with just the right amount of large fish. Mudflats, with overly confident waterfowl. Shorelines where animals would come down to drink and think a quick look around was enough. The richer the ecosystem, the more dangerous the initial stage. Because a new predator doesn't need to win big. It just needs to win enough. Enough times in a row. And that's where the rest of the swamp started to have problems. Because every predator in the Everglades had always played by the old rules. They knew whose waters belonged to whom. They knew which areas to keep and which to leave. They knew when to show up to minimize risk while still getting good food. The entire ecosystem operated on a dirty but effective agreement. Nobody was nice, but at least everyone knew the rules. Spinosaurus entered without those rules. It had no history with the Everglades. It had no reason to respect the swamp's old rhythm. And that's why it was far more dangerous than simply adding another name to the list of predators. Initially, its impact will seem quite small. Some previously stable, murky waters will empty faster than usual. Some coastal feeding grounds will become unpredictable. Some migration routes that native animals have long used will begin to feel wrong, as if the water is hiding something larger than it should be. No one will look at the scene and immediately conclude there are dinosaurs in it. The first thing that will appear will always be pressure. Invisible pressure. Pressure that makes other species hunt worse, rest less, travel further, and take more risks to find the same old food sources. That's how an ecosystem starts bleeding before it even realizes it's injured. And then competition will come. Not the kind where two monsters walk onto a stage and fight for the title of king of the swamp. Nature doesn't do it that beautifully. It settles things with hundreds of dirty, short, unpleasant, and costly clashes. A good body of water is encroached upon. A dead body on the shore no longer lies still for its rightful owner. A delicious, muddy ambush suddenly becomes unsafe. The first clashes won't need anyone to die to have consequences. They just need enough to make the native species start losing their effectiveness. And this is when Spinosaurus became a real problem. Not when it killed the biggest thing, but when it made old predators hunt less effectively. When a large crocodile had to retreat from a previously advantageous position. When a species accustomed to dominating a waterway had to start recalculating its operating hours. When seemingly stable areas began to be disrupted by a strange creature simply by its presence. In nature, victory doesn't always come from destroying the opponent. Sometimes, simply making the opponent's life worse is enough to change the entire game. Spinosaurus was worrisomely suited to that kind of victory. It didn't need to understand the Everglades perfectly to destroy it. It just needed to fit in long enough to grow. And once it started growing, the problem immediately worsened. Because a predator of that size couldn't live forever on easy, small prey. Its energy needs would swell with its body. Its territory would have to expand with its hunger. Its presence would no longer be stealthy. It would be forced to travel further, take more, and appear more frequently in places already occupied. That's when Everglades stopped being an interesting setting for a fun theory. It became a place that was trying to nurture a colossal mistake. And the more successful this mistake is in the early stages, the worse the consequences later. That's the trap of the whole story. If Spinosaurus were thrown into an environment that was too cold, too dry, too food scarce, it would be over quickly. It would fail, and that would be the end of it. But the Everglades didn't give it such a quick death. The Everglades gave it a chance. They gave it water. They gave it the edge of the shore. They gave it just enough prey to take root. And as soon as it successfully took root, everything else started to pay the price. So the real question isn't whether Spinosaurus could have lived in the Florida Everglades. For a period of time, it's quite possible. The real question is what it would have turned the place into before the Everglades could react. Because such a creature doesn't enter a modern ecosystem to integrate. It enters as a new threat that no species here is prepared to deal with. And in places like this, what destroys the balance isn't always the strongest bite.
Sometimes it's just a newcomer,
perfectly suited to the swamp for just long enough that things spiral out of control. At this point, the question wasn't whether Spinosaurus could hunt in the Everglades. That was already settled. It had established itself. It had found its rhythm. It was accustomed enough to the murky water, the muddy edges, the narrow creeks, and the shallow, flooded areas that it no longer seemed like a temporary anomaly. And that's when the most dangerous part began. Because a predator only truly becomes a disaster when it stops struggling to survive and begins to have time to expand. Everglades hated that period. An ecosystem can tolerate something unfamiliar for a short time. It can absorb a little chaos, a few gaps, a little new pressure. But what it cannot tolerate is a new pressure that begins to spread. And Spinosaurus, like all biological nightmares, didn't stop at simply surviving in one corner. Once food supplies in the initial areas began to dwindle, it would do what any sufficiently large creature would inevitably do. It moved further. It explored more watercourses. It began learning which areas were worth holding on to, which were only worth visiting, and which offered plenty of food but carried too much risk. That's when the Everglades really started to bend. Because once Spinosaurus crossed the line between survival and expansion, it wasn't just taking away food anymore. It was taking away stability. Areas that had previously operated on their old rhythms began to deviate from their familiar orbits. Species that used to enter the water at the same time each day began to linger for a few minutes, then a few dozen minutes, then completely changed their activity times. Native predators didn't die immediately, but they began to work harder to find the same amount of food. And in nature, that's almost a death sentence. If the entire system has to expend more energy than normal for long enough, the first thing to collapse isn't the weakest individual. Sometimes it's the very balance that all species have been relying on. Spinosaurus pushed the Everglades to that exact spot. No decisive battle is needed. No cinematic display of power is necessary. It just needs to appear frequently enough in enough places. It just needs other species to no longer be able to predict which waterfronts are safe, which channels are worth guarding, and which hunting grounds are worth guarding. And because it's unlike any predator this ecosystem has ever encountered, the best way to describe its impact is that it makes everything worse. Worse to find food, worse to rest, worse to raise offspring, worse to move, worse to anticipate danger. That's the kind of pressure that makes a swamp begin to rot from the inside out. And of course, when the pressure spreads widely enough, the consequences won't be limited to other predators. Herbivores, waterfowl, turtles, big fish. They all begin to react in their own ways. Some waterfront areas become unusually quiet. Not because they're safer, but because they become notoriously problematic. The old prey migration routes are diverted. Once bustling feeding grounds are now only intermittently active. From a distance, everything looks like the Everglades is still the Everglades. The water still flows. The grass still grows. The birds still fly. But at the systemic level, the gears are no longer meshing as they once were. That's the point where many people will start to think that Spinosaurus is winning outright. And it is winning, but not in a way that is smart for its own future. This is the biggest trap any apex predator falls into when entering a new environment that it's too well suited to in the beginning. The more efficiently it hunts, the more forcefully it forces other species to retreat, the faster it scavenges easily accessible water sources, the more it forces itself to move further to maintain the necessary energy levels. Such an animal cannot live on a few symbolic victories. It lives on the repeated volume of food it consumes each day. And that volume is not small. To maintain its enormous size, it must constantly convert opportunities into meat. And opportunities in the Everglades are not limitless. So from the swamp's perspective, this was the worst-case scenario. Spinosaurus was powerful enough to disrupt the system, but not stupid enough to immediately run headlong into its own demise. It did something far worse. It succeeded in a controlled manner. It expanded in stages. It didn't destroy everything in a week. It destroyed them slowly enough for the consequences to spread before anyone fully understood what was happening. And when such a creature begins to act as a constant force, the old predators will no longer be merely annoyed. They will be forced to choose. Give way, change times, change routes, or confront it directly when pushed to the edge. None of the options are good. Giving way means losing efficiency. Changing habits means stepping into a new disadvantage. And confronting a giant semi-aquatic predator at its peak physical condition sounds like a terrible plan for everyone involved. But nature seems to enjoy forcing things into such terrible plans. That's why this part is where the story shifts from an intriguing hypothesis to an ecological catastrophe. Not because Spinosaurus just proved it was the strongest, but because it proves something far more dangerous. It could live here long enough to turn a stable ecosystem into a malfunctioning machine. And once that happens, the consequences won't stop at a few contested fishing grounds. It will start running up the entire food chain like a crack in glass. Small at first, then longer. Then suddenly, no one will remember what the glass looked like intact anymore. The cruel part is this. If the Everglades had been too poor, Spinosaurus would have died prematurely. If the Everglades had been too harsh, it wouldn't have taken root. But the Everglades were just rich enough, warm enough, and complex enough to give it a good start. And it was that good start that turned the rest into bad news. Because now it's no longer a strange creature. Now it's part of the system. That's completely wrong. And every system pays a price when it starts operating around something that's wrong. That price, later on, will no longer be measured by vague changes in the rhythm of the swamp's life. It will begin to be measured by actual voids. Areas depleted of prey, species forced to retreat further. Chains of reactions that once started are very difficult to reverse. And that's when Florida realizes the opening question was wrong from the start. The question was never whether or not to release a Spinosaurus into the Everglades. The problem is that once it's established, there's almost no good way to force things back to how they were. But this is where the story takes a much worse turn than simply having another giant predator in the swamp. Because if things had only gone as far as Spinosaurus intruding into the food chain, pushing some species back, and then taking over part of the Everglades, that would still be the kind of catastrophe that nature sometimes reluctantly tolerates. An ecosystem can be damaged, distorted, and lose part of its old structure without collapsing immediately. But what started happening here was no longer intrusion. It was depletion. That's the difference between a nuisance alien species and one that's large enough to break through the entire system's tolerance ceiling. Spinosaurus couldn't sustain that size by living moderately. It had no choice but to eat less, rest more, or shrink to fit its surroundings. Such a creature doesn't negotiate with its own energy needs. It just keeps demanding. It needs this much food today, more in a few months, and then even more. And the Everglades, however vast, wasn't an ecosystem built to sustain such a machine for an extended period. That's when victory begins to become a problem in itself. The waters that once gave it the opportunity to take root no longer yield the same abundance as before. Areas once teeming with prey are beginning to dwindle. Not disappearing completely immediately, but enough to remain for a while, yet no longer sufficient to sustain something that is growing and becoming increasingly biologically expensive. That's the most dangerous kind of shortage, because it doesn't kill quickly. It forces the predator to travel further, work harder, take more risks, while still maintaining a massive body to function every day. And when an apex predator is forced to expand its range because the nearby swamp is no longer sufficient, all that was once an advantage begins to change for the worse. Each further movement burned more energy. Each exploration of a new body of water increased the risk of collision. Each deeper incursion into unfamiliar territory increased the probability of injury, miscalculation, or too many missed hunts in a row. Previously, Spinosaurus benefited from novelty. Now its presence was clear enough for the rest of the Everglades to adjust around it. Prey was more cautious. Areas that were once easy prey were no longer. Old predators, though not overwhelming, had learned to avoid the most disadvantageous positions. The swamps didn't defeat it with a single counterattack. The swamps began to defeat it with a progressively increasing survival bill. And this is the unique twist in the whole story. Spinosaurus didn't come close to defeat because it weakened. It came close to defeat because it did too well at being a predator. It won too much. It caused too many areas to lose their rhythm. It forces too many prey animals to change their behavior. It forced too many competitors to retreat from previously established positions. At first glance, it all seems like a sign of dominance. But for an organism that needs a plentiful, consistent, and recurring food source, dominating an ecosystem too small for its hunger is like cutting off the legs of a chair one by one. At first, it seems high. It seems victorious. Then, at some point, everything plummets at once. The Everglades are entering that phase. The gaps were no longer vague signs. They were real gaps. Areas of water once worth holding were no longer worth holding. The old prey migration routes were disrupted too far. Spinosaurus's most effective hunting grounds were being drained faster than they could regenerate. The entire system entered a state where each side had to do more to get less, and neither side paid the heavier price than the biggest. It's the curse of being at the top of the food chain in a place that isn't big enough for yourself. A large alligator can retreat to a smaller area and still survive. A python can endure longer. Some bird species can change their habitat, their time zones, their habits, enough to get through bad seasons. But Spinosaurus lacked that kind of flexibility. It was too big to be invisible, too expensive to fail repeatedly, too specialized to transform itself into a smaller, more economical creature, better suited to modern Florida. It carried within it the logic of another world, where rivers were larger, prey thicker, and the entire biological structure around it was built to withstand things of similar size. The Everglades are different. Everglades can give it a start. It can't give it a long-term future. And that's when things got really bad. Not because the swamp suddenly became stronger, but because Spinosaurus started to get stuck in a very bad state. To survive, it had to take more. But the more it took, the more it impoverished its own near future. To maintain its current energy level, it had to expand. But the more it expanded, the more energy it burned to maintain its presence. To continue being the most fearsome thing in the system, it had to be ubiquitous. But the more ubiquitous it was, the fewer places retained the abundance that had initially given it its roots. This is no longer a story about who is stronger than whom. This is the story of how the body's size eventually began to betray its owner. Once that happens, the signs of decline won't appear as they do in the movies. There's no scene of it suddenly weakening and falling down on a beautiful afternoon. Real ecological decline is often much more tedious and cruel. More failed hunts, more long journeys, more water areas that have been tested but then abandoned, more risky decisions in places where risk wasn't necessary before. Eventually, the swamp forces it to behave like a gambler trying to recoup its losses from past wins. And that's the scariest part of Florida. It doesn't necessarily kill with teeth first. It kills with limits. Limits on prey production. The limits of space. The limit of a modern ecosystem is having to nurture a biological machine from the Cretaceous period. The limits of any victory are reached when it is pushed too far beyond sustainable levels. So, even here, Spinosaurus might still look like the king of the Everglades. It might still be the shadow that silences the water's edge. It might still be the one that all other species steer clear of. But beneath that exterior, the question has changed. It's no longer asking who dares to challenge its place. It's starting to ask a far worse question. How much is left for it to remain true to itself? And the Everglades' response, however slow, however dirty, however quiet, is gradually leaning in a very bad direction. And that's where the story reaches the worst possible ending for a predator like that. Not a glorious death, not a final battle grand enough for the entire swamp to remember, but something far more unpleasant, a perfectly logical ending. Spinosaurus wasn't defeated by the Everglades in a single day. It was worn down by the very things that had initially helped it win. Shallow water, riparian edges, easily accessible hunting grounds, just enough abundance to take root. All those initial advantages now turned against it like a trap. They had helped it stand firm. They were also what prevented it from ever realizing it was squandering its own future, one meal at a time. This is the part people usually dislike in apex predator stories. They like the climb to the top. They like the part where all the other species start to get out of the way. They like the feeling of an ancient creature entering the modern world and proving that it's still formidable enough to occupy a place at the top of the food chain. But biological reality rarely cares about coolness. It only cares about energy flow. Whether there's enough food, whether there's enough prey density, whether there's enough production to keep a massive body functioning day after day. And here, the answer is no. Not immediately. Not the kind of full this morning, starving tonight scenario. Everything unfolded more slowly and cruelly. The best hunting grounds were becoming rarer. Trips were getting longer. Decisions were becoming more risky. The waters that once felt almost like its own were now eerily silent. Not peaceful. Empty. Empty because everything that once lived there had drifted away, died, or learned to disappear sooner than before. The swamp didn't retaliate with a bite deep enough. it retaliated with receding water. And a creature like Spinosaurus couldn't survive long in a world that was running out of exactly what it needed most. That's the most bitter paradox of the whole story. It didn't lose because it couldn't adapt. It lost because it adapted too well in the early stages. Too much to grow. Too much to expand. Too much to force the ecosystem to revolve around it. And as soon as such an organism succeeds enough to force the entire ecosystem to change to it, the price of that very success begins to come back. Prey decreases. Native species change behavior. The richest food sources no longer maintain their previous yields. And in the end, the one at the top of the food chain is the one that suffers the most when that chain begins to break. Florida doesn't need to be stronger than it to win. Florida simply isn't enough for it. That's a huge difference. An opponent can be beaten. A limit cannot. Towards the end, Spinosaurus would become something almost no species in the Everglades wanted to confront head-on. Yet no ecosystem there could sustain it either. It could still traverse the water's edge like a catastrophe. It could still silence other species as its shadow swept across the murky waters. It could still look like king of the land if one only glanced at it for a single afternoon. But that title was now empty. A swamp king, impoverished by its own feet, was still a loser. Only a slower and larger one. And that's precisely why this topic is so scary. It wasn't because a prehistoric dinosaur could defeat an alligator or threaten the entire Everglades. It was because, for a brief moment, it truly seemed to have found its home. Everything crucial was there. The right temperature, the right water, the right terrain. The initial conditions were rich enough to offer hope. It was this almost perfect appearance that turned the ending into bad news. If the Everglades had been completely wrong for it, the story would have ended faster and more gently. But no. The Everglades were just right for it to climb, then slowly retract the ladder. By then, there weren't many ways to turn back. It couldn't shrink. It couldn't switch to a more frugal lifestyle. It couldn't convince the entire swamp to grow faster to feed its hunger. All it could do was keep moving, keep searching, keep squeezing more from an ecosystem already distorted. And each subsequent step only made the outcome clearer. That's why the opening question of this video turned out to be wrong from the start. The question shouldn't be, what would happen if you released Spinosaurus into the Florida Everglades? Because the first part of the answer is actually quite simple. It could survive. It could hunt. It could win. It could make the entire swamp adjust around it. The correct question should be, what happens after it wins? And the answer is, nothing good. The Everglades are out of balance. Native species are forced out of their old rhythms. The food chain is skewed. Gaps begin to appear in places once teeming with life. And Spinosaurus, which looks like the biggest winner in the whole story, ends up in the same place that so many giant invaders end up when they become too successful in a system that isn't big enough for them. It isolates itself. It impoverishes the very playing field that is suitable enough to keep it alive. It found no new home. It found only a more fitting place to die a slow death. And that's the chilling conclusion of this whole theory. A Spinosaurus in the Florida Everglades wouldn't turn it into the glorious home of a prehistoric king. It would turn it into a prolonged experiment in what happens when an otherworldly predator enters a modern ecosystem, wins every battle it needs to win, and then discovers that the greatest victory is sometimes the slowest path to defeat. Because being at the top of the swamp doesn't mean you belong to the swamp. And Florida, ruthless as always, will let it learn that on its own.